It's just an amazing experience of understanding how this can be used by people to save lives, not by just injecting people with Narcan, but making sure that these pernicious chemicals don't reach and destroy our citizens and our communities.
This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Podker. A sustained influx of synthetic opioids, including fentanyl, has resulted in a crisis in our country. With much of it originating in foreign territories, recent actions have been taken at the executive level to address the supply chain and flow of illicit drugs into the United States. We are joined today by Louise Shelley, Distinguished University Professor Emerita, and Omer L. and Nancy Hurst Chair Emerita at George Mason University. Dr. Shelley is a leading expert on the relationships between terrorism, organized crime, and human trafficking. Dr. Shelley, thank you so much for joining me today.
That's my pleasure to be here with you.
I want to start with a real overview question because maybe some people only hear the term from news headlines and that kind of thing. But what is fentanyl and why is it so dangerous?
Fentanyl is a synthetic chemical that is much more potent than any of the natural drugs that are out on the market. And you can consume a tiny, tiny bit of fentanyl and die immediately from it.
What makes it so toxic?
It's the chemical construction of it, and it has just enormously powerful chemicals that are destructive to the human body.
I understand it's kind of hard to trace quantities of it, like people are getting it mixed in with other drugs, or they were maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I was more in the loop of how it's working. But you can't really test it as a consumer, like on a street level, right?
The fentanyl is now being mixed into legitimate drugs as well in Mexico and being sold in local pharmacies there and makes it into supply chains in the U.S. So the fentanyl arrives in this country in two primary ways. One, it comes directly from China to individuals who press it into pills in this country. And they don't do any scientific testing of the potency. And people who buy these on street corners and others are the ones that are often the fatalities in this, or people who need to be rescued with Narcan. But there's also a tremendous shipment of these precursor chemicals, and there are other ones that are even more potent than fentanyl that are now being produced in China. And almost all the production of these precursor chemicals is in China, and now they are traveling to Mexico, as they've been for a long time, and they are being mixed into the fentanyl that is then shipped across the border.
Is it almost all international, or is any of it kind of being manufactured here in the States now?
The precursor chemicals are almost exclusively a Chinese production. There's a little bit that's going on in India. The drugs that are being mixed for sale are going on in factories in the U.S. and in small-scale production facilities, so there's a range, but we are still dependent on the import of these precursor chemicals for the fentanyl to be produced.
How do you track these networks?
What is unique about the research that we have done under our National Science Foundation funding is that we have gone back to the source, and we are looking at the tens of thousands of websites that are advertising fentanyl and nitazines for sale in the United States. And nobody else in the research community and no one else in the government has done this. And we have discovered over 30,000 web pages that are advertising this. And each one of these web pages has multiple synthetic chemicals that they're advertising. And then we are also finding thousands of companies that are producing these chemicals in China and exporting them.
Are these legitimate companies in their home countries, or
Yes.
is it all underground?
No, that's what's wrong in most of the analysis. where people have said they're rogue companies. No, these are licensed companies. And often fentanyl and other synthetic drugs are just a piece of their production. So it may represent between 10 and 60% of their production. And we can't say exactly how large these companies are, but they're not small companies. Many of them who've been sanctioned, or those that have been sanctioned, are really large chemical companies. Many of them are getting subsidies from the Chinese government. And that's why they're diversifying their production from legitimate chemicals, because they get a 13% subsidy to produce these synthetic drugs for export.
Do these synthetic drugs have any legitimate uses?
If you are going through an operation, you may have a tiny bit of fentanyl put into your anesthesia. But there are 5 companies in China that are registered to produce medical uses of fentanyl for export for our anesthesia market. And the 2,400 companies that we've identified that are involved in this sale have no legal right to be doing this. So often there are some of these drugs are prohibited and they have a formula that's prohibited. So they tweak with it with one little chemical formula that then they can say, well, we're not producing a named chemical.
Interesting.
But the consequence for the consumer is the same.
Right. I understand you've introduced AI technology into your research. How is this helping you understand supply chains?
What we're finding is that in the beginning we thought we had many, many more companies than we actually did have. And what you need is that we're generating, if you're looking at 30,000 plus websites, how do you connect the information that's in these websites? How do you know that they have similar addresses or similar telephone numbers? That's what AI helps us do, is to do very large-scale data analytics very, very quickly. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, after very lengthy and human-intensive investigations, came up with 21 companies that they, indicted. They've identified as really serious problems. And in 2.5 months of our data analytics, using advanced engineering tools, AI, we found 19 of those 21. And many of them were on our list of key companies.
Just a little better tool for sorting the data and connecting those dots.
Well, it's the ability to find it so readily and to find the associations of these companies. For example, one company may have 30 companies associated with it.
Right. So how does using this technology to find these companies, how does that allow you to help disrupt the process, the flow, the importation of these things?
It's absolutely key to know who's producing them. Because if you don't know who's producing them, you can't disrupt the supply chain. And therefore, only by going back to the source can you get certain insights that you need to disrupt the supply chain. And that's really key. And almost all of the cases that have been generated of fentanyl prosecutions in the United States have required going back to the source. But unfortunately, the people who are going back to the source have a very limited number of companies they've identified because they're not using this advanced data analytics that we have that allows you to find thousands of companies and the associated web pages.
I know you've done a lot of work with other kinds of trafficking situations, like human trafficking. Can you kind of compare how those supply chains differ or are the same as, say, a fentanyl supply chain?
Our first grant from the National Science Foundation dealt with human trafficking. And the largest human trafficking network that was ever found in the United States and was prosecuted involved 350,000 web pages of advertisements and involved locales in the United States, Canada, and Australia that were operated out of China using advertisements. And some of the techniques to find this human trafficking network were generated by DARPA. And so I had heard about this case, I had written on it. And so by understanding how you can use images that repeat or telephone numbers that repeat, they were able to put together and understand and help dismantle this largest human trafficking network tied to one group of individuals. And so that's a similar problem. It all operates very similarly as a playbook. And so you can see it in human trafficking. You can see it, during the pandemic, we worked on counterfeit PPE, counterfeit, medical masks that were going to hospitals and emergency medical workers. And we had a partnership with 3M that was part of our research plan. I mean, we didn't know exactly, but our research plan was that we were going to get data, and they had the most data, and they didn't have data analysts, and we had data analytical capacity. And with a small team, within 2 months, we started disrupting these supply chains because it worked according to this pattern that had already been identified in human trafficking research. And so as a result of that, we helped disrupt these networks, and 60 million counterfeit masks were confiscated all over the world. 30,000 web pages were taken down, 30,000 social media posts. And I remember one time the masks were transiting through a free trade zone in an Asian country, and they were headed for Japan. But there was a U.S. customs officer, and he knew that all 3M production was needed in the United States, and therefore it could not be going to Japan.
Interesting.
So he halted the shipment, and the governmental authorities said, but, we're giving you a very short period of time because this needs to transit, and, what are your grounds for this? So he sent us the bill of lading. And with that, we could see that this was the same artificial, fictitious bill of lading in many other counterfeit shipments that had already been confiscated. So within 24 hours, we were able to show him what the criminal network was, using AI, what the comparable data and imagery were, what mistakes there were in that page that revealed that it was the same network, and that shipment of 800,000 counterfeit medical masks for Japan were stopped.
Wow, that's some real impact. I assume you have students working under you. Do they get excited when they can see that kind of difference being made?
So we produced this research on a large scale on fentanyl for the fentanyl report done by the House Select Committee on China and the Communist Party. And they needed data very quickly. So the only way we could do it was to partner with the data analytics program at George Mason. And we were assigned this capstone class for the master's program who just got into it and would spend, dozens of hours a week cracking this problem with such passion, such fascination, such devotion. And the Hill Committee would say, we're just a bunch of patriots working like this to really begin to understand the scope and the elements of the problem, because nobody in the government has been doing it. It's a piece of fundamental research. We didn't know when we started out that we'd be able to figure out who were the producers by looking at a bunch of web pages. So that's what fundamental research is about. That's what the National Science Foundation is about. But nobody else was risking it because they wanted to spend the money on finding criminals. But if you find them far down in the supply chain, you may be helping one community, but you're not really disrupting the whole supply chain, which is what this research allows us to do.
Right. So how has NSF support really reinforced your research here?
I mean, without NSF support, we couldn't have done this research because we need to pay student support. We need to have, the intellectual support that our program officer in the engineering division has provided. And it's been a faith that there is really something rational in not only understanding legitimate supply chains, which engineers have known for a long time, but of illicit supply chains. And being part of a community that is looking at these issues in different sectors is just a very intellectually reinforcing, but this thing has enormous practical applications.
Right. It makes a real difference to the average person on the street, ultimately. Like family members, how many people's family members, somebody you know has been impacted by this in the last decade? Like the numbers are ridiculous.
And my own family as well, extended family. I mean, it's affected all of our society. And I refer to this sometimes as dual-use crime, because it does not only generates money, but it destroys communities. And so this is just like the opium wars that the U.S. were part of in China in the 1840s, 1850s, helped undermine Chinese communities then. I had called this the revenge of the opium wars, and that was the question that I asked. Is there some element of state involvement, just as there was in the sale of opium to China?
Heading towards the end of our conversation here, I want to ask you about how approaching trafficking from a scientific mindset, how does that make a safer America?
Oh my God, it's just incredibly important. Because if you go after this problem on a piece-by-piece basis, like one network at a time, it's just like, mushrooms after the rain. You just eliminate one and others pop up. But what you have to do is to understand how the phenomenon works. And it's absolutely key for law enforcement because you have to trace the money. The common wisdom in how to go after illicit activity is follow the money. But if you don't know who is generating the ads, then you can't follow the money. And therefore, you can't understand what is, who is generating this. And one of the people that we worked with, one of the chief investigators of the House Select Committee, had done a case in northern Ohio in which they'd found a company they'd managed to find the company that was responsible for the deaths in their jurisdiction, and they sanctioned the company. And the company then complained that they were going out of business because they'd been sanctioned. No, that's exactly what you use sanctions for, is to try and get after malicious actors. And so that's why to understand this on a larger scale is key. Also, if you want to prosecuting a case is a very expensive activity in time. So therefore, you want to focus on key nodes. But how do you know who are the key actors unless you do the data analytics, as we're doing, and see which companies are most interconnected to other companies? And that then gives you a sense of where you need to prioritize resources. So understanding illicit supply chains lets you know what you should do, where you allocate resources, and where you can have most impact in cutting off these devastating supply chains to the American public.
For my last question, What's next in your work? What are you excited about in the future? What new technologies are unlocking for you in this research?
The next stage is to do more data analytics that allows us to understand, who should be key targets, how you stop the money flows, because part of this is generating enormous profits, just like that enormous human trafficking organization generated human profits or profits from human exploitation. One of the ways of having large-scale databases is that it allows you to follow the money much more effectively. And that, taking the financial incentive out of it, is a very important way of going after the criminal activity. So we're not there fully yet. We're getting there, and it's just an amazing experience of understanding how this can be used by people to save lives, not by just injecting people with Narcan, but making sure that these pernicious chemicals and the next even more harmful variants that we're seeing online don't reach and destroy our citizens and our communities.
Dr. Shelley, thank you so much for joining us today. That was terrific.
Oh, my pleasure. I love the support that National Science Foundation has provided for us to make this possible. And you wouldn't believe how appreciative people are.
Special thanks to Louise Shelley. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Potker. Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts, and if you like our program, share with a friend and consider leaving a review. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.